This is an introduction to the history of the Wabana Engine and Hose Company Number 1. Prior to the Civil War, firefighting was really not very well organized. Somebody yelled fire, somebody came and helped you get your stuff out of the house and put the fire out if possible. Keep it from spreading is more like it. Prior to 1870, only very large cities had full-time fire departments. Rural companies had associations of people at best. It was rare in rural Michigan to have fire insurance on a home or a business. Construction costs were very cheap. You didn't have plumbing and electrical and gas to worry about. And you had plenty of lumber because that's all there was here was lumber. So it was relatively simple to erect, and there wasn't a whole lot of need for fire insurance, and companies didn't write this far out anyway. Prior to the Civil War, this was the frontier. As fire insurance became more affordable, desirable, and available, insurance companies sponsored their own fire brigades in big cities. The birth of the term firemark grew out of those associations. You had a mark on your house next to the door, and it told the public who your insurance company was. If you had a fire, they called the insurance company, and the insurance company sent out somebody to put out the fire. So early departments had their own main pieces of equipment at their disposal. It was not very practical in Portland with 600 people in 1876 to have a couple of insurance companies fighting over who's going to put out your fire. So associations of people formed. These associations became clubs. Clubs kind of morphed into one big club. And that's how fire departments formed in cities. Either associations or mutual aid societies or cities themselves sponsored them. This is what happened in rural Michigan, or anywhere else for that matter. When you had a fire, somebody got out of the house, yelled at the neighbors that you had a fire. The neighbors sent somebody into town. Somebody had to wake somebody up at the fire station, ring the bell, wake everybody else up in town, man the fire station, drag the equipment out to the fire, and this is what was left by the time they got there. This is actually my mother's house in Clare County in 1942. You can see the stove is right here, and the chimney, and that was all that was left. Early firemen's tools. As fire and mutual aid societies formed, they did have some tools available to them. Does anybody know what these are?
Spammers.
Close.
We have a fire hydrant, sort of that.
No. The most valuable possession you probably owned in 1865 was your bed. They were expensive, they were well formed, and they were the heart of the home. If you had a bed to sleep in, you were good. Otherwise, you slept on a pallet on the floor. These are bed wrenches. And most houses had them, most fire departments had them. You went in, somebody started fighting the fire, somebody started taking out the stuff to save it, to save your possessions. And these helped you deconstruct the bed and chuck it out the window or the door.
Wow.
It's amazing.
Another early fireman's tools, anybody know what these are?
Fire buckets.
Fire buckets. They're leather. Every home in a well-appointed home or business had one of these in the front vestibule next to the front door. If you had an indoor pump, which not all houses even in Portland had at the time, indoor water, you filled it and set it at the curb. And somebody would come along and grab it and run towards the fire. If you didn't, you just threw it out the front door. And somebody would fill it up wherever they could and continue to fight the fire. And this is a salvage bag. Usually, if your house was on fire, it was too late, but not always. So because they didn't have elaborate wall coverings and carpets, the carpets they might have had were wool, houses burned rather slowly at the time. And you might have some time after you check the bed out the front door to grab the silver or money or valuables, pictures, cookware. Cookware was more valuable than the money. And toss it in these bags, and people would check them out the door. But more likely, if your neighbor's house was on fire, you were likely to do that at your house, because if you were downwind, it was a crapshoot whether or not your house would be saved as well, depending on how close it was and if you were downwind. So they had your name on it, you chucked it out, and hopefully your neighbors would pick it up and take it to the local church or to their house for safekeeping, and they knew whose stuff was in what bag by the name on the bag. Does anybody know the historical significance of the date October 8th, 1871? Very
Chicago
good.
fire?
Chicago fire. Was also the date of the Peshtigo fire. On the same date, up in Peshtigo, Wisconsin, Marionette County, a fire started by lightning mostly. They don't know how it started. There are several theories, one of which was even a comet that broke apart and fell into the forest. But it was the end of a very long, dry, 2 years drought. And a terrible wind caught up, started the fire in Peshtigo, Wisconsin, burned about 75% of the town. Moved across the Door Peninsula into here, this is the Door Peninsula. Moved across to the Door Peninsula, burned across that, jumped the lake, burned Manistee, Holland, Ludington, Alpena, Gaylord, Grayling, and in particular, Port Huron. It's also known as the Port Huron fire. 75 to 80% of Port Huron was destroyed in this fire.
Was that all from acid blowing
Yes.
across?
It was that, also the terrible wind was across all of this area, and any logging camp burned off their slag, their slash and burn, it's the term slash and burn. Their slash was the leaves and twigs and that kind of thing, the pine boughs. And so those were put into a pile and burned. Those would smolder for days. If a wind kicked up, that would become embers that would go for a long ways and cause forest fires. And they figured that it was either both, either or. But there was evidence of the fire jumping Lake Michigan.
Didn't Chicago fire do that too?
The Chicago fire did that too. That's why Holland was involved. Because the fire that came from Peshtigo came from the northwest to the southeast and went right through Gaylord and Grayling, missed Mount Pleasant, and jumped the Saginaw Bay and hit Port Huron. When I was doing genealogy in Clare County, I was reading the contemporaneous Clare County newspapers, and for weeks, farmers loaded up food, clothing, hay for horses, because all of that was destroyed, and took off on wagon trains for the Thumb in Port Huron in relief of the farmers that lived there. And there were accounts in the newspapers from people who had no warning of this fire. It was just a storm to them, just an average regular storm, and had no warning of the fire. And the fire actually burned faster than the telegraph lines could warn the towns ahead of them. So people saved themselves by jumping into creeks and lakes and ditches and all sorts of things.
Just north of Port Huron, little towns, they had to go out in the lake. Like
Yeah.
Huron.
Yeah. So out of all of this conflagration, before then, insurance companies were, I won't bore you with the insurance stuff, it's kind of technical. Insurance companies were stock companies. They had to satisfy their stockholders. Because the Chicago fire took all of the resources of insurance companies for states, all states around it. There was nothing left over for Holland and Ludington and Port Huron to rebuild, and so out of that grew mutual insurance companies, but that's a different story. You can see me now. Sometime between 1871 and 1876 grew the Wabana Engine Company number 1 and Hose Company number 1. It had been talked about for several months throughout the town. Several fires had occurred downtown to the wooden buildings. Almost all the buildings downtown were wooden at the time. And the something had to be done syndrome came about, and a group of men businessmen primarily got together and decided there needed to be something a little more formal. So, to quote this, at a meeting held in Mr. Cothran's building on the west side of Kent Street in the village of Portland, June 12, 1876, the following named persons were present and signed their names. And you might recognize some of the founding names of the village, such as Cothran, Griffin, Hickson, Knox, and Blanchard, were all members of the first department. J.C. Cothran who owned a hardware store over there, I believe, was elected foreman. Orman Brown was the first assistant foreman. J.H. Peet was the secretary, and George Pilkington was the treasurer. And the bylaws were adopted on July 10th, 1876, and the department got its name, the Wabana Engine and Hose Company number 1. Wabana, to satisfy Lanny, is an Indian word meaning looking glass. So we found that out when we were researching the soon-to-be revealed piece of equipment downtown. We won't give it away. But it was an Indian word meaning the looking glass river. They did not meet again, however, until November 19th of 1877, when the bylaws were tweaked and members who had not dropped out or lost interest were polled about continuing with the department. New members who had shown interest were chosen for interviews. You got on the department by making an application, citing your qualifications, and then the qualifications were presented to the members, and the members voted you in or out. A bit of a popularity contest, but also you had to show some willingness to meet the requirements of the department. You had to be available, you had to show up at fires, you had to show up at trainings, and that sort of thing. If you weren't fulfilling your qualifications, you were voted out or not voted in at all. On November 26, 1877, the village president arrived and told those assembled at the engine house, I'll show you where that is in a minute, that there was no such thing as a fire company in this town, and you're not allowed to use the room for a meeting, but you could use the jail room. The meeting dispersed and reconvened on November 29, 1877, where inactive members were dropped, new members were elected, and apparently hard feelings with the city were smoothed over, most likely because that same night, this happened before the department was fully functional. As you can see here, this is Distinctive Occasions Blue Mason Jar Building, right here. And this is the bridge at Bridge Street, and this is everything in between. You notice these foundations are wood. These walls appear to be brick, but it's difficult to tell. But all of these pilings and foundations along here are wood. So these buildings were wood. And they burned down before the department was fully functional. So the city decided maybe it was a good idea to sponsor a fire department. As a result of the fire, the village council enacted one of its first zoning actions called the fire limit. I don't know why it was called the fire limit, it doesn't make any sense. But it decreed that all construction from now on downtown was brick or block. No more wooden buildings downtown. This is the first firehouse from about 1880 until, I believe, the mid-40s. This building, and it was not only the engine house, it was also the city hall and the jail. This is approximately, this is Margie Briggs's house. This is my house. This is about where Phil Light's building is. And this is about where the pizza shop is now. And this is about where the cable satellite company is. So this is about where City Hall is now, right here. There were 2 houses there, but this was the engine company, and the horses were in the back.
How long did you say? Till what? From when?
From 1880 till, the building existed until about 1840, but it wasn't, of course, wasn't used as the City Hall then. It was surrounded by blacksmith shops, which is a good place to keep horses. It was still there in 1918. You can see this building has changed somewhat. This building has taken its shape, its current shape, and the building is still here. What you didn't see in this picture, is a fire hydrant that's there now. So there was no city water that was here. So those water sources were the tanker, which was the only engine they had at the time, a horse-drawn tanker, or the river, or buckets that they brought from the town pump, which was at the other end of this block.
It's a great bell. I wonder whatever happened to that.
That's the first question everybody who sees this picture asks, and we wish we knew to right along with you. Because we would love to preserve that bell, however, it no longer exists.
Yeah.
However, by 1918, fire hydrants started to appear. This DH stands for dry hydrant, which in fire department parlance is one that's not connected to a water system. It's its own individual well, generally serviced by a pump of some sort, or just a hole on which you could stick a hose and pump water out. But water sources other than the river or the town pump were becoming to be available. So how did they raise an alarm? There was no cell phones, there were no beepers, there were no plectrons, there were no sirens. Believe it or not, on December 6, 1877 meeting, the company purchased, or ordered to be purchased, the largest size triangle they could find. That's what it actually says in the book, the largest size triangle to be found. And this was installed at that fire barn. So if someone heard or yelled fire, someone would run down to the station and start banging on the triangle. And then, if you were too far away from the station to run down there in a timely manner, usually your factory had a steam whistle of some sort. You would ring that, and then somebody else would wake up and go down and ring the triangle. And then, anyone within hearing distance of the triangle or steam engine would actually, they had assigned officers to run up to the churches and start ringing the bells. Churches weren't locked back then. But when at 2 o'clock in the morning, if the church bell starts ringing, you start running for the fire department. So that's how they raised the alarm. In January of 1878, equipment continued to be collected and trained upon. Training began on the proper use and effects of the acid and soda contained in the fire extinguishers. They were used to coat or put out a small fire. They generally, the fire outsped the extinguisher, and so then they were used to coat the buildings next to the fire to try and keep them from being inundated with fire. This glass bottle contains sulfuric acid. It's not something you want to kick over in the night. However, if you tipped it over like this cage went down in this hole, the cover was screwed on and held it in place. When you inverted it, this was filled with bicarb, sodium bicarb, which would counteract the effects of the sulfuric acid chemically, which would produce carbon dioxide, which would cause the fire extinguisher to expel fluid at a high rate of speed, cover more area. So this was the first fire extinguisher. However, you didn't want the horse to kick it over in the barn because you would have a big problem.
How much area would that cover?
Probably would cover this room actually,
Really?
because it had a foaming action. The sodium bicarbonate would have a foaming action. It would help in extinguishing a fire. If it was course, if it was a small fire, if it was the room full of fire, probably not.
No, because they did a area about,
Yeah,
you could, that.
Yeah. but it would buy time until the fire department came. At subsequent meetings in December of 1877, procedures were developed to appoint special wardens to watch over the public's personal property that was carried into the street, or if you threw your bag out, somebody had to make sure that it was safe. And so the department appointed wardens to go around and collect all the bags and watch over the property. The village purchased an engine for the department to be housed at City Hall. And although no photos of the engine exist, it would be something like this. This photo is from 1909. So, but in 1877, it would have looked somewhat similar. It was purchased for the sum of $1,000, including all the hose, 1,000 feet of hose, and was made by the John Bean Company in Lansing, in Indiana.
I know that picture.
Some equipment was made right here in Portland. This is the Bauer and Lehman Blacksmith and Wagon Shop on Grand River and Maple in 1911. Note the cab of the wagon is over here, the wagon itself, and then the wheels are over here.
That's my great-grandfather and his brother. And they're working on an Asian Newman wagon too.
In 1906, the Wabana Engine and Hose Company No. 1 grew into the Portland Wabana Fire Company No. 1 and 2. They found that they had so many applicants, it wasn't quite feasible for everyone to show up all at once. They had a lot of untrained firefighters, young firefighters who were training because there were no formal training programs. So company number 1 showed up first. They were the ones that lived closest and had the most experience. And they would get things rolling, and then when they needed relief, fire department or company number 2 would show up. They hadn't quite the same experience, but they were able to relieve and learn on the job as they went along. Again, you were elected to the department or elected off the department. Sort of a built-in training system. Things hummed along like this until 1915, when the department began exploring the possibility of reforming under the name Portland Fire Department. And on March 12th, 1915, new bylaws were adopted for the name Portland Fire Department, and they were presented to the village board for approval. This picture are the firefighters on the department in 1917. The top row left to right is Ernest Stifler, Ray Mann, Charles Goodwin, Ford Armour, Orville Stifler, and Dan Watson. Kneeling are Mr. Shepard, there's no first name given, Lawrence Miller, Kelly Penfield, Frank Potter, Clifton Lytle, Carl Williams, and seated are Bert Weed and Willard North with his gun.
He looks like a young child.
Yes. Probably the mascot. Equipment became more sophisticated over time and techniques more effective, and formal training more prevalent. It was around this time that formal firefighter schools and certifications became available. 1 or 2 members would attend the school and bring back to teach what they had learned. And this photo was taken in 1922 in front of the auto and implement dealership on Kent Street at Academy, where the City Hall is now.
Looks like Like's garage.
Yeah. It wasn't at the time, but yes, it's the same building. And you can note the glass transoms that are memorialized in the main entrance of City Hall. It has these glass transoms above the door. Also in this picture is Howard Lowry, right here, who was the longest serving member of the fire department up until 1955, and the longest serving chief of the fire department. This was a postcard that he sent to his father, or his son sent to him when he was in Alpena, living for a year for work.
Was the son Fred Lowry?
Yes.
Great.
There's a scratched in the surface, it says, "You are here." Right here. You can barely see it. The other side of the postcard says something about, "I charged 55 cents of meat. Tell Ma I took 50 cents out of my bowl, and I'll pay her back." By the 1940s, trucks and equipment continued to improve along with their price. However, this engine in 1940, we still have this truck. In 1940, it was a Ford pumper.
Not that truck.
No, I'm sorry, this wasn't this truck.
No.
We still have a 1940 Ford pumper that we use ceremonially. But the problems still remain. Our equipment still laces over from time to time. By 1955, though, brave men and later women still persevered. This is the same Howard Lowry from the earlier photo, now a longtime chief. So the equipment progressed from horse-drawn wagons costing $1,000 to engines costing $175,000 in 1999. This engine just went down the street to a department in northern North Dakota last month. To our newest engine delivered just last Friday for $600,000.
Wow.
This is a pumper rescue. So it has just about everything you would need on it to rescue someone from a burning building, from a car flipped over on the freeway, to a cat stuck in a tree.
That hold water also?
It holds just a
Probably
couple of
got
hundred gallons.
Probably got 200 gallons.
Just a couple hundred gallons, just to get it started. The water goes in through the front and goes out through the, this is a,
That-
yes. I'm not up on all the terminology.
It's a what?
A deck gun.
Oh.
It shoots water quite far. And then there are outlets on this side and the other side for water and foam. So you would hook it up to the hydrant and one end and pump it out everywhere else. And these gentlemen, you can't quite see it, but right under his arm is a series of about 12 levers that you can control that entire, everything on the truck from that one spot. All the gauges, all the levers, all the in and out, all the foam, everything. So one person can now run the whole truck instead of, used to take 3, then it took 2, now it's down to 1.
They took the old one to where, North Dakota?
North Dakota,
Did they buy it or?
they bought it,
They didn't?
yeah. And they flatbedded it out on Friday.
We saw that one go by the museum Saturday. I think it was that one.
Could have been.
Yeah, they were out driving around.
Yeah, I saw it.
They kind of, yeah. I don't know. This is a light bar that has LED lights on the top that can go 360 degrees. So it pops out of the top and it can light up an entire fair scene. They're quite proud of it. It was made, the cab, everything from Zach on forward is made in Spartan Manufacturing in Charlotte. And everything from Jake on back is made in Spencer Manufacturing in South Haven. So the whole truck was made, except maybe the actual chassis, in Michigan.
Really?
So that's it.
Thank you.
Debbie,
Very good.